London, September 1937. J. Bruce Ismay met his reclusive end in a quiet apartment. Logic dictates that escaping the most defining shipwreck of the era alive would be the ultimate relief after such trauma, the final salvation after 2 hours and 40 minutes of terror in the Atlantic. But historical archives show the exact opposite reality. For Ismay and the other 3 wealthiest men rescued in those lifeboats, survival was no miracle. It was the beginning of a suffocating sentence. What society, the press, and the invisible weight of that dawn did to them lasted for decades. It proved to be an ordeal far heavier than the ocean itself. Ismay was not the only one consumed by this living burden. In fact, his ruin was just the shortest of the 4. On the bitter cold morning of April 15, 1912, the heavy silence of the North Atlantic was broken by rescue. 705 people were pulled from the unforgiving freezing waters onto the safe deck of the ship Carpathia. Among these survivors, exhausted, traumatized, and wrapped in rough blankets, were 4 of the richest and most powerful men aboard that 4-stacked giant. They were gentlemen who controlled textile empires that dressed European royalty, directors of massive transatlantic shipping lines, and heirs to fortunes built over generations. They survived that night because they secured a spot in the scarce lifeboats. Days later, they disembarked at the port of New York under the deafening noise and the relentless glare of camera flashes. An anxious crowd waited for them in the pouring rain. For those watching the arrival, and for the entire world consuming the first newspaper headlines, that moment should have represented the final relief, the ultimate salvation, the absolute end of the nightmare. But the documented reality proves something cruelly different. From that exact moment at the harbor, the simple fact that they were still breathing became, systematically, the worst thing that could have ever happened to each and every one of them. What society, the aristocracy of the time, and the court of the press did to these 4 men is not the kind of story you find in Hollywood blockbusters or traditional tributes to the event. Their true ruin is not submerged in the dark of the ocean. It is coldly documented in admission records of psychiatric hospitals. It is filed away in the expulsion minutes of the most exclusive British elite clubs. It lies in bitter, unopened letters and in million-dollar contracts canceled overnight with no formal justification whatsoever. For early 20th century society, there was a silent, unbreakable rule. Those who held extreme power and influence should have given up their seats and gone down with the bow of the ship. The wealth that had guaranteed them absolute privileges their entire lives now condemned them to public shame, relentless scrutiny, and complete mental destruction. They escaped the physical shipwreck of steel and ice, but they slowly sank in a social trial where lifeboats simply did not exist. And if you value historical research done with respect, solid documentary foundations, and human soul, take this brief moment to subscribe to the channel. What the archives reveal from this point forward shows how survival for these men became a sentence far more enduring and far more punishing than the sea itself. The imposing image of the 4-stacked ocean liner cutting through the dark of the North Atlantic hid a terrifying truth. Below the waterline, the collapse had already begun. After the fatal side scrape against the wall of ice, the destiny of that engineering marvel was sealed. The bow was sinking slowly and methodically, pulling the structure down, a clear sign that the giant would soon snap in half. It is in this scenario of silent despair, contrasting with the external grandeur of the ship under a star-studded sky, that we find the first man of our story. He was not an ordinary passenger. He was the managing director of the shipping line, the highest-ranking civilian executive on board, the man who, years before, had authorized and signed the construction order for that very vessel. He controlled the largest fleet on the ocean, holding a fortune calculated in the millions of British pounds. On that cold dawn, official records prove he did not stand by idly. For hours, the Tycoon worked actively on the upper deck, helping to load dozens of passengers. Panic grew at the exact same rate the water swallowed the lower corridors. When the last available collapsible boat was being positioned to lower, the situation reached its critical breaking point. The director looked around, and in that specific perimeter of the deck, there were no more women or children in sight. The boat was about to be lowered into the freezing water. In a fraction of a second, driven by the absolute instinct of self-preservation that lives in every human being, he stepped forward and took a seat. He survived. The lifeboat pulled him away from the rupturing ship. But that single step cost him the rest of his existence. Have you ever stopped to think about the heavy burden of a judgment you cannot appeal? Because that was exactly the invisible court waiting for him on dry land. Even before he stepped off the rescue ship, the press machine had already decided his future. The biggest newspaper publisher in America at the time, who by coincidence harbored an old commercial rivalry against the British executive, saw the tragedy as the perfect opportunity for a devastating attack. The published headlines did not mention the hours he spent helping passengers on the deck. They defined him with a single lethal word: coward. The narrative forged on the front pages painted a powerful man who had fled his own ship, leaving over 1,500 people behind. Months later, the exhausting official investigations, led by government commissions, reached a conclusion based on sworn testimonies. The official verdict was absolute innocence. Authorities confirmed he did not steal anyone's seat, and that he only boarded when there was no one left to save within his reach. It did not matter. The truth of the documents could not erase the condemnation of the headlines. The crushing pressure of public opinion was so overwhelming that the director was forced to resign from the helm of his own company. London's aristocracy expelled him from their circles. Old partners turned their faces away when he walked by. He spent the next 25 years isolated, alternating between closed-up apartments, refusing social gatherings, and living in absolute silence. His millionaire fortune could not buy a single day of peace. The press condemned him to life in prison inside his own life. He was destroyed by a newspaper rivalry. But what awaited the next survivor on our list would be triggered by something much smaller, an almost invisible detail, a simple piece of paper that would make an entire financial empire crumble to the ground. The ruin of J. Bruce Ismay was orchestrated by an old rivalry and the crushing power of a press tycoon. It was a large-scale attack. But what was about to destroy one of the greatest financial empires in England would be something incredibly small, something almost insignificant to the naked eye. A simple piece of paper measuring just a few inches. And here we reach the core of how society operated back then and the exact moment when the story takes its most unforgiving turn. Sir Cosmo Duff Gordon was a British baronet. He carried a noble title, inherited through generations, and commanded a textile empire responsible for dressing the elite and royalty of all of Europe. His personal fortune, in the year 1912, exceeded the 2,800,000 British pound mark. It was the kind of wealth that dictated the rules of the game in London's high society. During the dawn of the disaster, as the ship yielded relentlessly by the bow after scraping the ice, Cosmo and his wife, Lucy, found refuge in lifeboat number 1. The structural capacity of that small, wooden vessel was 40 people. When it was lowered into the dark waters of the Atlantic, it carried only 12 occupants. Official records from the boards of inquiry confirmed under oath that there were no more women or children visible in that sector of the deck at the exact moment of boarding. Up to that point, his journey mirrored that of many privileged survivors, What ultimately sealed his fate occurred right after the rescue. In the exhausting environment of the savior ship, looking at the sailors who had rowed boat number 1, men who now had nothing left but the wet clothes on their backs, the baronet decided to act. He handed £5 to each of the 7 crewmen. His documented intention was to help them replace their toolkits and belongings lost in the sinking, an act that, under normal circumstances, would be seen as aristocratic charity. But to document the act, he signed a receipt, and it was that very signature that sank his empire. Weeks later, during the rigorous United States Senate investigation, that exact £5 receipt was presented as evidence. The reporters in the room did not wait for the court's official explanation. The headline that crossed the oceans the next day was delivered with surgical, destructive precision. Newspapers printed in bold, massive letters that the baronet had paid off the crew of the nearly empty lifeboat. The implication hidden between the lines of that news story was a cruelty without precedent. Society read the headline and concluded with absolutely no factual basis that Cosmo had bribed the crew to row away, preventing boat number 1 from returning to rescue those still fighting for their lives in the freezing waters. The official court cleared him of all charges. The justice system recognized that the money was a donation made long after the immediate danger had passed. But, just as it happened with Ismay, documented innocence meant absolutely nothing to the London elite. The court of public opinion had already issued its sentence. In September of 1912, his name was crossed off the membership list of the prestigious Royal Thames Yacht Club with no right to appeal or defend himself. Suppliers broke off million-dollar contracts overnight. The continuous, silent, and suffocating pressure forced the sale of his massive textile company in the year 1915 for a mere tenth of its true market value. £5 destroyed £2,800,000, not because the payment was a crime, but because public perception, forged by a newspaper headline, was unyielding. Sir Cosmo died in the year 1931, completely isolated on a country estate in Surrey. The British papers, which once dedicated entire pages to praise his business ventures, published short obituaries, barely 2 lines long. The money crumbled. The reputation turned to dust. But while the first 2 men faced public rage and social cancellation, the third survivor of our story would discover that the most lethal enemy of all was not printed in the newspapers. It was rooted deep inside his own mind. The third man in our story did not have to face the merciless court of public opinion, the expulsion from high society clubs, or the destructive headlines forged by the press of the era when Archibald Gracie IV disembarked at the New York pier. Under the drizzle and the magnesium flashes of the photographers, he was acclaimed by everyone as an absolute hero. He was a colonel in the United States Army, the direct heir to a respected dynasty of real estate investors who shaped the foundations of Wall Street, and a renowned author of complex books on tactical military history. His personal reputation remained completely intact after the disaster. His family fortune remained untouched in the vaults of New York. However, the cost of keeping air flowing into his lungs would demand a price far more silent, invisible, and lethal than the ice during the final, chaotic moments of the sinking, as the 4-stacked giant yielded relentlessly to the crushing weight of the ocean. After that fatal scrape against the wall of ice, Gracie vehemently refused to seek a seat in the few available lifeboats. Freezing water was already dominating the lower decks. He stood firm on the upper deck, which was tilting at an increasingly terrifying angle, helping dozens of frightened women get into the small wooden boats. He worked endlessly until the dark waters of the North Atlantic, recording temperatures well below freezing, reached his knees. The sea was not just rising. The bow of the ship was being swallowed whole. When the colossal steel structure finally could no longer withstand the pressure, snapping in half, With a deafening roar and the rear section began to go down, the colonel was violently sucked into the vortex. Gracie fought with all his might against the absolute darkness and against the crushing pressure on his chest. He managed to surface, gasping and nearly unconscious, clinging by pure instinct to a wooden door that had torn loose from the luxurious interior of the ocean liner. In the pitch black, he swam to Collapsible Boat B, a small vessel floating completely upside down. He spent the rest of that macabre dawn balancing on the slippery hull, his feet submerged in the lethal water, listening to the heavy silence that settled in after the great ship was gone. He physically survived that superhuman ordeal, but his mind was never able to leave the surface of that ocean. Upon returning to the welcoming comfort and safety of his mansion on American soil, a process of internal collapse began. The newspaper photographs showed him elegant, safe, and sound, but his family noticed that the fundamental structure of the man had been irreparably broken. Gracie suddenly lost the ability to sleep. The slightest nighttime silence in his bedroom instantly transported him back to the terrifying sound of tearing steel and to the utter loneliness of the open sea. He lost his sense of taste and gradually stopped eating, and instead of trying to forget the trauma like other survivors did, the analytical and military mind of the historian pushed him off a cliff of obsession, one that would consume absolutely every ounce of his remaining energy. He began to write compulsively, day and night, without a single pause. He rewrote his testimony of those final hours. He analyzed who was in which boat, where every order came from, and what the exact engineering failure had been. He was producing 82 pages of dense notes that no maritime authority had ever asked for. The colonel needed to document every fraction of a second in a desperate attempt to bring some technical order to the monumental chaos he had witnessed. Gracie dove deep into the diagrams, the mechanics, and the engineering to try and understand how the Unsinkable had succumbed. By the way, if this same quest to understand the technical, structural, and design flaws captures your attention, it is absolutely essential that you read the ebook, The Anatomy of the Giant Titanic .pdf. It is a dense historical dossier featuring documentary maps, critical decisions, and original blueprints of the ship that the ocean could not erase. The official link for you to access this material is right down below in the first pinned comment. But for the American colonel, this relentless quest to dissect the anatomy of the ship was exactly what stopped him from living. The doctors who frequently examined him at his residence recorded a clinical picture of extreme chronic exhaustion, severe weight loss, and profound melancholy. His body, which had once endured lethal temperatures and colossal physical effort to stay afloat on an overturned boat, simply began to shut down. In December of 1912, exactly 7 months after the fatal event, Archibald Gracie IV was admitted in critical condition to the Presbyterian Hospital in New York. The man who saved dozens of lives met his end at 53 years of age. Right beside his hospital bed, on a nightstand lit by a dim lamp, rested his massive, unfinished manuscript. Gracie was the only one of the 4 surviving tycoons who never had to face the merciless court of society. The poison that slowly consumed him did not come from headlines or from the abandonment of former business partners. It came from inside his own mind, from the absolute inability to let the past sink. And it proved to be equally fatal. He died in an exhausting attempt to explain what happened, but the 4th and final survivor on our list would make the exact opposite decision. He chose the path of absolute silence, paying fortunes to guarantee that no one would ever know what his eyes had captured that night. The external image of the ocean liner gliding silently through the dark, its 4 imposing smokestacks casting shadows over the placid waters of the North Atlantic under a star-studded sky, projected a feeling of unshakable grandeur. It was a brief and necessary breath of majesty, a peaceful vision that clashed violently with the imminent horror. And it is precisely under this contrast between the calm of that night and the brutality of destiny that the journey of our story's fourth man was drawn. Unlike the shipping company director, the aristocrat who owned empires, or the colonel focused on military history, this fourth survivor had a completely different profile. He was remarkably young. He was a highly prominent professional athlete, and already emerging as a rising star within the ruthless financial investment circles of New York. His presence aboard the largest ship in the world was not motivated by commercial agreements, corporate inspections, or business trips. He bought his luxurious first-class ticket with a single, intimate goal: to cross the ocean to be closer to and win over the young woman he loved. Her wealthy family deeply disapproved of the relationship, considering him inexperienced and inadequate. When the vessel suffered its fateful side scrape against the massive underwater wall of ice, the young banker did not freeze. Long before the vast majority of passengers could even grasp the lethal gravity of the situation, he sprinted through the elegant corridors, woke the young woman and her family, and guided them with firmness and urgency to the upper deck. He made absolutely sure, with sheer determination, that everyone safely boarded the fifth lifeboat to be lowered into the freezing waters. From a seemingly safe distance, yet painfully close enough to offer a crystal-clear view of the nightmare, he watched the giant's final agony. He witnessed the bow being slowly swallowed by the black immensity. He heard the deafening roar of the steel structure snapping in half under a colossal force. And finally, he saw the stern plummet and vanish into the abyss. In the weeks that followed the sorrowful arrival on American soil, the press machine, which had been so quick to destroy empires and rip apart reputations, decided to treat him in a radically different manner. Reporters and editors turned his experience into a true heroic fairy tale, born right in the epicenter of the worst maritime tragedy of the century. The public narrative focused exclusively on the passionate hero who defied destiny to save his true love. They were married just 3 weeks after the traumatic rescue. To the outside world, to readers desperate for a breath of hope amidst collective mourning, he was the great, undisputed victor. The man who beat the unforgiving ocean, won the family's blessing, and was on his way to dominating the nation's finances. But the intimate truth of this survivor was a heavily guarded fortress, far heavier and much darker than any celebratory headline could ever suggest. He never came forward publicly to correct the romanticized and simplistic narrative spun by the newspapers. However, in a single, extremely rare public statement given shortly after the disaster and never repeated again in his entire life, he let the true, crushing scale of his trauma slip through. He revealed that the 4 days confined on the rescue ship, squeezed among survivors in shock, uncontrollably weeping widows, and the deathly silence of those who had just lost everything, were infinitely worse than the shipwreck itself. The human despair and the unbearable pain he witnessed on that deck of salvation dug claws much deeper into his soul than the physical sight of sinking steel. What happened in the following decades defines the complex abyss between resounding public success and silent ruin. The athlete and banker built a life that, to the bright eyes of society, bordered on absolute perfection. He raised a solid family, multiplied his fortune exponentially, reached the absolute top of his career ladder, and became one of the most powerful and respected executives of his generation. On the outside, he was the survivor who thrived the most. But on the inside, there was an invisible, incredibly expensive toll being collected every single day. Whenever eager reporters, curious historians, or investigators tried to get close to extract some untold detail about that cold dawn, he acted with unyielding, surgical precision. He simply opened his checkbook and paid exorbitant fortunes to ensure those interviews were never published. He actively and systematically bought the silence of the press. Never again, under any circumstances whatsoever, did he utter the name of the ocean liner in public or at social gatherings. His imposing mansion was a heavily guarded territory where the past was strictly forbidden from entering. While the other three tycoons were publicly destroyed by cruel headlines, by the judgment of social clubs, or by acute visible nervous breakdowns, he made the conscious decision to build an impenetrable financial wall to suffocate his own memory. But the weight of what is left unsaid is usually the most suffocating inheritance a family can receive. Decades later, his descendants admitted that the deathly silence he imposed lasted his entire life, and that the whole family suffered without a doubt from the ghosts he paid so dearly to keep quiet. He was the only one of the four incredibly wealthy men to build a long, prosperous, and seemingly normal life. Yet, physical survival exacted its price in daily, invisible installments of repressed anguish. The young banker did not sink physically in the Atlantic, but he spent the rest of his long existence literally paying to avoid remembering what the darkness of the sea had shown him. The Colossus of Steel, revered as the undeniable peak of modern engineering and the largest moving object ever built by human hands until that moment, took exactly 2 hours and 40 minutes to completely disappear beneath the dark waters of the North Atlantic. On that dawn of April 15th, 1912, the sea temperature had plummeted to an unforgiving 28 degrees Fahrenheit, an absolute cold that ended the journeys of 1,503 lives in a matter of minutes. For those souls, the horror met a physical and definitive end in the vastness of the ocean. However, for the 710 individuals who managed to reach the surface and board the rescue ship Carpathia, the true ordeal was only just beginning. And for the 4 richest men among the survivors, the simple act of drawing breath the next morning turned into a condemnation that would drag on relentlessly for decades. Early 20th century society demanded an incredibly high toll for privilege. Documented statistics prove the brutal disparity of that night. 97% of the first-class women were saved, while only 25% of the third-class passengers managed to escape from deep within the hull. Wealth categorically dictated who had access to the upper decks and the scarce lifeboats. But in a lethal and devastating irony, it was exactly that same wealth that turned Jay, Bruce Ismay, Sir Cosmo Duff Gordon, Archibald Gracie, and Carl Baer into the prime targets of a public judgment from which there would be no possibility of defense or appeal. The world did not forgive the fact that they took seats that, in the popular and passionate perception of the time, should have belonged to the less fortunate or to those who went down alongside the 3 million iron rivets driven into the ship. J. Bruce Ismay, the visionary executive who once dreamed of dominating passenger travel on the seas, met his biological end 25 years later. He lived as a true reclusive ghost in the most expensive and quietest neighborhoods of London. He was trapped in an unforgiving narrative and destroyed by a press machine that condemned him to perpetual social exile long before any official board of inquiry could evaluate the hard facts. Sir Cosmo Duff Gordon, the noble heir who commanded the textile empire responsible for dressing European aristocracy, saw his solid businesses crumble like paper, ruined by a biased headline and by the laughable weight of a 5-pound receipt signed on the deck of a rescue ship. For Colonel Archibald Gracie, the undeniable hero who gave up space and fought for his life on an overturned boat, the punishment was self-imposed and lethal. He simply could not bear the crushing weight of his own traumatic memory, spending his final breaths in an endless obsession to rewrite, decipher, and document every single gear and tactical flaw of that unforgettable tragedy. His body, which survived freezing waters on the worst night of his life, shut down in a state of chronic exhaustion a mere 7 months later. And Carl Baer, the young banker who, to the fascinated eyes of the world, got the perfect happy ending by marrying the woman he loved, built his extremely prosperous life using small fortunes just to buy the silence of reporters. He suffocated the ghosts of that dawn and forced upon his own family a generational weight that no one was ever allowed to ask about. When we analyze the original documents, the government inquiries, and the legal records of the era, a harsh realization becomes absolutely unavoidable. Not a single one of these 4 men was formally condemned. They were all declared innocent by the competent maritime authorities. Civil law found 0 crime in their survival actions. However, the court of the streets, the elite of the time, and the invisible judgment of their own conscience operated under a code that was much darker, far crueler, and entirely irrevocable. They managed to escape the deepest and coldest waters in the history of navigation, but they never managed to escape the shadows of that night. The ship of dreams became, in practice, the perfect mechanism for the silent ruin of each one of them. Because when all is said and done, surviving the disaster was not a divine miracle or a majestic second chance for these 4 tycoons. In the purest and most terrifying documented reality, it was the longest and most exhausting punitive sentence of all.